Hi, and welcome to Breakfast with Royals. This is Michelle from Michelle's Midheaven, and my guest today is David Fischer, who is an amazing friend and astrologer. Welcome, David.
Hi, Michelle. Very good to be here.
Hi. David, just to introduce you, you are a full-time astrologer and you're mainly using traditional techniques. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I focus my practice on the traditional techniques that I know, although I am not unfamiliar to the modern approach, and I do incorporate it in my practice as well from time to time.
Great. And you specialize in studying the charts of royals. And today you're going to demonstrate a very intriguing chart example. We're going to look at the natal chart of Alexandra Feodorovna. She was born Alex from of Hesse, and she became the Tsarina of Russia. But first, maybe it would be interesting if you could just tell us why you like to study the charts of royals particularly.
Well, this started back a couple of years ago when I wanted more trustworthy sources so I could see some timing techniques that I was learning about at the time really playing out in the person's life in a personal example. And sometimes when you don't have a very detailed narrative of how the life of the person went, it's kind of difficult to do that with charts of people that you don't know. But with royals, it's quite simple because they have their whole trajectory very well documented. And so it's easier for me to just go and see a bunch of documentaries with different perspectives from one moment in their lives and be able to judge it a little more accurately to see when things happened, why they happened, so I can better see the techniques playing out in the chart. So yeah, that's where my obsession came in, and started with the Russian family really. Alexandra was one of my first charts that I studied.
Yeah, it's funny that we'll be doing that today. I didn't know
Yeah.
it was one of your first charts. Yeah. And today we're going to look at some of the major events that happened in the Tsarina's life, and we'll look at the chart while you will explain how we can see these events in a natal chart, and especially the natal promise today, right? And the next episode, we'll also talk about the Tsarina, but that's when we will come back to these events. And then you're going to sort of do your magic and show us some amazing timing techniques, right? So today we're going to see what is happening in the life and what we can see in the natal chart. And then the next time we will see when everything sort of develops and how the life so yeah, I have to pull up the chart, right? I'll just
Yeah,
do
okay.
that.
While you're pulling up the chart, yeah, in this first encounter, we're going to be talking about more of the placements of the planets in the natal chart, how they are dispositioned, which planets are together with what planets, and see how that played out in her life as a natal promise, which means this is all just like a premise. And in the later episodes, we're going to show a bit of the timing techniques to see how those natal promises were prominent in certain events that we are going to show today as well and go over. So yeah.
Okay. So here is the chart, and I'll maybe start from the beginning. When she was still little Alex, she
Yeah.
was actually Queen Victoria's favorite grandchild, wasn't she?
She was. Actually, it was because of a sad story, mainly. She was said to be a very happy child by her family. But there was this event that when she was about 6 years old, she lost her mother and her favorite sister, the one that was closest to her in age, and that she played with a lot, Maria or Marie. She died very young, and her mother a month later. So the sequence of losses in her little girl's life, especially by her primary caregiver, the person who was always there with her, caring for her. Her mother was a very loving person, which is uncommon for royal families, for the parents to raise their children. The royal British family at that time used to do that more closely. So losing her mother was a very huge blow for her as a child. And Little Alex, she used to be called Sunny, which is interesting because you see the sun here in her first house. And one of the ways she was known by her family was Sunny, and the sun is being eclipsed, which is a very ominous thing to have in a chart like this, knowing what happened later in her life. If you don't know what happened, we are going to explain, don't worry. But this is already, like you see here, the loss of the parents when the child is very young, in this kind of dynamic in the chart. Like you have a malefic here, which arguably could be considered to be the malefic of contrary to the sect, acting as the worst kind of malefic. I've seen examples in this chart in other instances where it does seem to act out as the worst malefic instead of Saturn, for those of you who understand the sect concept. But it has a malefic in the first house, so harsh circumstances, the sun and the moon together in an eclipse, and that familial presence for her, that motherly presence for her was eclipsed. The moon there involved in that eclipse is a harming condition for both luminaries. So it represents that loss of the parental figure. Her father, of course, was not the most present person in her life, as fathers usually aren't, especially in these cases. So she went from relative to relative. She used to go a lot to her grandmother's house, because her grandmother, as soon as she lost her daughter and she saw that little Alex was still so young, she was like, oh, poor thing, let me take her in. And she was a very obedient child, Alex. She was a little spoiled, sure, but who wasn't in those days, being a royal? But they liked her in general because she was poised, she was polished, she knew how to behave, she knew how to speak well, she was very likable in overall in the British court. And Victoria actually had her over a lot of times, but she was queen, she couldn't have her over all the time. So Alex was raised particularly by nannies and caregivers that were not really loving figures from her family. They were just people being paid to take care of the children. So she never knew much of that attachment. We see this here, like the ruler of the ascendant is in the 12th house. The 12th house is a house that says that losses in the child's childhood, in the child's life, will impact their consciousness throughout life. They will have these experiences in childhood surrounding loss, or being afraid of loss or losing something, or surrounding mental instability, mental illness. And she later developed a lot of anxiety because of all the trauma that she had been through, losing stuff as a child, and then later on with the threats to her life, as we are going to see. And this eclipse plays a lot into it.
Yes, and I suppose there were very high expectations of her, and Queen Victoria also had somebody in mind that she would like to see Alex get married to one day, right?
Well, yes, Queen Victoria was trying to direct Alex in the best way possible, because she was like, yeah, I have a suitable granddaughter here. She's pretty, she's tall, she's like impressive. She could be a good match for an emperor or king. And so she was thinking about her own lineage, trying to marry Albert Victor, then the heir to the throne in Britain, to Alex. But Alex didn't correspond. Like, he even proposed to her, but she didn't want anything to do with him. We see here that she was taken in by her grandmother, and her grandmother was someone that tried to raise her up to high standards. We have here the 7th house, which is the house of the grandmother, the 4th from the 4th in derivative houses, being ruled by Jupiter, and also being the significator for marriage in her life. Jupiter in itself already signifies exaltation and high standards and honorings and all of that. So there is a foreshadowing here of her grandmother trying to marry her off with a future king, to what was about to happen here. She already had someone in mind when Victoria tried to marry her off, but she wasn't sure yet. She was still to fall in love with Nick, which is her future husband that we are going to discuss.
Yeah, and could you tell us something about that, when they actually met for the first time?
it's an interesting story because you see here that we have the sun being the ruler of the third house of siblings, being in the first house there. So I know there are a lot of planets in the first house, and so many times when you see a stellium, especially with eclipses, you see these kind of faded events that involve the whole dynamic of that house that is encompassing the eclipse within the stellium. So all those planets kind of play a factor in it. She had to travel, I think, to Russia to see the marriage of her. She had just turned 12, so she was in a first house. I'm not going to get into that. That's going to be in timing techniques in the next few videos. But she was having some important activations through those timing techniques. And the sun, who's the ruler of the third, is co-present with Venus, the ruler of marriage, right? And she went to to her older sister's wedding. And that's when she met Nick. That's the first time when she turned 12 that she saw them, and she was one day destined to marry and one day be the Tsar of Russia, one of the most powerful men at the time in Europe. So you see here that in that moment, when she was having some interesting activations that we are going to cover later, that her promise here of Venus being with the sun in the first house, and that wedding environment having also something to do with her own wedding. We see that with eclipses. There are some events that seem to be faded. So there is this whole idea around she was in a wedding and she met the love of her life. They instantly were attracted to each other. They kind of knew of each other and they kept each other in mind. So much so that after a few years, this was 1884, she was 12 when they met in June. She wouldn't meet him again until 1889. But then when she went to Russia and spent 6 weeks in St. Petersburg, they actually hit it off. They actually fell in love pretty quickly, and they actually knew they wanted to be with each other for the rest of their lives. So, and this is notable in their story. They had a very passionate relationship, both of them, because they were so perfect for each other in each other's eyes. And no one could convince them otherwise for the rest of their lives, really. So indeed, they were, I guess you could say that, made for each other.
Yeah, they really fell in love. And Jupiter is exalted also in the moon's sign. And the moon is in the first house, of course. It's as if her lover truly exalts her.
Definitely.
Yeah,
You see that even from previous intendants, previous people that wanted to marry her. She had only a high standard, for the line of how do you call them, bachelors that she would see.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't look at actually anyone else other than Nick, and Nick was the one who exalted her most of all. She was his queen. She was crowned in such a style, almost, she was never equal to him in Russian's eyes. She would never be, but she was crowned in grand style, and he made a grand parade for her in most places that they were together. Like, people knew that he was very in love with her all the time.
Yeah, and then their marriage, though, and their engagement comes with some tragedy, right? There is a lot going on, and Nikolai's father becomes very ill just a couple of months, I believe, before they were supposed to get married. Could you tell us a little bit about that, maybe?
Yes. What was going on is that the political climate in Russia was terrible at the time. You have here an interesting conjunction between Uranus, the symbol for revolution, and Jupiter, which is her symbol for husband. Her husband was the Tsar of Russia, the last emperor of Russia, and he was deposed by revolutionaries. So that Uranus exactly conjunct with Jupiter there is speaking a little bit to that, foreshadowing a little bit to that. And the political climate of Russia, therefore, when they got married by the end of the 19th century, was rising up to it's boiling hot, you see? So Queen Victoria was not happy at all to send her favorite grandchild into that hot pot of water. But she accepted it, which was not common, really. Nobody was really in favor of this union. Nobody wanted to see the Tsar of Russia married to a minor in Russia, that is. no one wanted to see him married into a minor British royal family with a branch that didn't have much importance. Like, she was not a daughter of a king. Of course, she was the granddaughter to the Queen of England, but you know, who wasn't granddaughter, a grand duke, or grand this, grand that in the midst of the royals at that time? So she wasn't quite that important for the Russians, for Nikolai to marry. So his father was the one who had most power to stop the marriage from all the people that were against it, which was literally everyone, because there was no political gain at all in this match. They were just marrying for love, and you know, that wasn't really a thing. So, but luck, or fate, as you would call it, was on their side, because no one really opposed, even though other matches within those same branches of their families from other couples was stopped. One of them even resulting in exile from other relatives of them. While those happened, theirs was, you know, all green lights. You can do it. Okay, go on. Nobody likes it, but since you're gonna do it and you're determined to do it, just go ahead. Nobody can convince you to otherwise. You're very stubborn. So when Nikolai's father started to lose his strength and get sick, he noticed that he probably was going to die soon. He started being afraid that he was going to die soon. So he kind of gave in to the pressure, because it was like, oh my God, my son is making this so much more difficult than it needs to be. He's not understanding the purpose of this whole emperor thing. So, okay, go on, marry the girl you want to marry, have some kids, and just secure the line. So basically that was it. I believe that if his father had not gotten sick, he could have convinced Nick through a bit more pressure, because Nick was not that determined. He could have convinced Nick through a bit of pressure to give in and not marry Alex, perhaps. But as fate would have it, since we're talking about eclipses, you see all the circumstances seem to open up for them to actually get together and marry. And so soon after the death of Alexander III, Emperor of Russia, which was in November 1st, 1894, they got married. They got married on the 26th. He was buried in the 19th, and the whole funeral was a huge spectacle. And Alex herself said that the spectacle of the wedding just felt like she had changed from a black to a white dress, but still she was in the same mournful celebration, in the same mournful party, let's say. When she went to her own wedding, she was like, it was still like a funeral. It was just a continuation, but it was just wearing white. So in equal manner, you see, there is this foreshadowing here. All this foreshadowing is very much like eclipses. I want you guys to see with this natal promise and the prominent eclipse position that we have here, that everything in her life felt like was building up to what happened in the future that we are going to cover. But at this point, she was married to him. And when they were crowned a couple of years later, less than 2 years later, but a couple of years later in the calendar, they were distributing out gifts for the people at the main square there in Russia, I think close to the Kremlin or something like that. And there was a stampede when the people realized that there weren't any gifts, because there were much more people there than they had anticipated. Of course, there wasn't that good of an organization at that time, so they couldn't contain the crowd, and it got much bigger than they could handle, and it went out of control, as it often does, and a lot of people died. So there was the fact that she came to them behind the coffin, because she was married to Nick after the Tsar died, immediately after, and there was this huge crowd being killed off by police that was trying to contain the stampede results, and a lot of people were stomped on, were crushed to death. A lot of people were killed by police officers trying to contain everything and stuff. So a mess, and people started being a little weary of the Tsar's power, and what the Tsar actually meant.
Yeah, of course. And I can imagine that the Russian people saw the death of Nikolai's father first, and then the disaster following their wedding, like you said. The Russian people would have surely seen this as two very bad omens. And it's like their marriage bore the mark of death from the start, as it were. And I suppose we can see the connection with Saturn in the 8th house opposing Jupiter, the ruler of the marriage.
Definitely, that ominous opposition there of the Lord of Death himself, and being in the house of death in its own domicile, being opposite to that Jupiter exalted. It's like reality was always banging on her door. At the moment where she was feeling most exalted, she was also facing her most challenging circumstances up to that moment. Oh, and what also that Saturn opposite to Jupiter speaks about now is the fact that she was hated by the court. They didn't like her at all, by the Russian court. So you see, the people that were around her husband, the circumstances around her marriage were not ideal, because she had this whole antagonistic circus of the Russian court, judging her and not liking her for her very cold German ways of being. She would try to knit like a housemaid. She would try to get her ladies in waiting to get groups to do some knitting together to blend in, and that was just not the kind of things that Russian upper class did at the time. They used to be very snob. They used to be like, the servants will do all the hard work, and we will occupy ourselves with the matters of state. And for a Russian empress, occupying yourself with the matters of state was boring children, and specifically sons. So she had 4 daughters from the go. She didn't know any Russian. She couldn't speak much Russian. And she didn't have much knowledge of their culture in itself. She just knew she loved Nick. So all this reality around the circumstance of her marriage kind of took off a little bit of the goodness of that Jupiter exalted in the 2nd house. And the fact that the moon has no connection to that 2nd house to nurture it, which means the ruler of the 2nd house, Cancer, doesn't give it any support because it's not able to make an aspect to it. Her marriage is good. It has all the pomp and circumstance, but even so, there are a lot of other circumstances always making that a harsh decision. So she's always having to decide to do something that she really wants, and she gets it, but through very harsh circumstances on the other hand. We're going to see that playing out as well with her son when she finally gets a son after the 5th try. So we have, I was mentioning also that she had problems with her Russian. Her and her husband, they communicated through letters, a lot of letters and notes taken by the servants up and down the castles, the palaces and stuff. And when Nikolai was off working, she would send him letters all the time. And they would only speak in English because she was not very good with Russian herself. And we see here that we have Mercury in the 12th house, being that the one who manages speech, the ruler also of her 1st house, the way you present yourself to others. She was very ostracized by the way she spoke. She was laughed at. She didn't know how to convey her ideas very well initially, and so that just made her withdraw more. She felt unaccepted in the Russian court, and that just made her manifest that Mercury-Pluto there as an obsessive compulsion for isolation, because she felt she was being threatened by the court. She felt she was being threatened by the political climate around Russia, and that nobody understood her, which was true to a certain extent, but she didn't make an effort to make herself understood because she thought they had to understand her because she was the empress after all. She was entitled to their devotion, which was something that she was not getting at all. And that just made her withdraw as, a victim that she felt she was being made.
That's very interesting, David. I would like to add, though, that she must have felt an enormous pressure that the people really expected that she would produce an heir to, she only gave birth to daughters first. And so I can only imagine how much pressure was on her, to what was expected of her.
She was extremely anxious, and she had several health issues. There were a lot of them were psychosomatic, or seen to be psychosomatic now by historians, when when you look at it and when you analyze her behavior. And she was rightfully anxious because when she had 4 daughters, and that didn't get her any popular amongst the Russian court, but what it did was give her a reason to isolate, because she would always put her whole pressure of being isolated to the fact that she needed to take care of her family. She needed to give attention to her daughters. And the Russian would hate her more for it, because they were like, okay, you need to take care of your daughters, but leave that to the servants a little bit, because you also need to be a queen. You also need to be doing state things. And she was just trying to keep herself private, just like Queen Victoria had taught her. You see, she's playing off something that she had learned from the British court that was not working in this new environment. And this is a very marking characteristic as well of having the ruler of the ascendant, and in this case also the ruler of the 4th house where you live or your country, in the 12th of isolation, ostracization, people marginalizing you basically, or you isolating yourself because you feel like you cannot connect or communicate to those people. That produced a lot of ailments. She was constantly in a wheelchair after a certain age, after her 30s, because she suffered since she was a teen from a lower back pain, which is also something to do with the nodes. I mean, this spine problems, I see it repeatedly, people that have the luminaries with the nodes, or the ascendant with the nodes, or something like that with the nodes, they might have a problem with their spine somehow. This is just something that I've observed when they're active. And she had in the lower back, she would be carried around in a wheelchair all the time. She said she had palpitations, so heart issues. She had migraines. And you see that Mars and the eclipses happening, that pressure in the 1st house coming from all directions. That's what I said about the stellium in the beginning of the video. This 1st house, her body, herself, she feels pressured by all these other factors around her. And the children part was just like 5 consecutive pregnancies, and she wouldn't stop having them until she had a son. So she had 4 daughters, which further incapacitated her body in a lot of ways. And in the last one, it just became worse, because Alexei, the youngest, the final child and heir to the throne, the golden child, in other words, who was a Leo, he was hemophiliac. He was born with something that she blamed herself for passing on to him, because it's generally, I think, passed on by a female bloodline, I'm not sure, which is hemophilia. It was a royal disease, because because royals intermarry, they married within their families, and that can cause a lot of genetic problems, because a lot of recessive genes that cause these problems, these health issues, get passed on more surely through bloodlines that have that, but on both sides.
Yeah.
So Nick and Alexandra came from the same family tree. They both had the gene. They both passed on to their child, and he died. But at that time, I think it was believed that only women could pass that on. So she blamed herself a lot for having the curse of her family passed on to her only son, who was their only hope of maintaining the political climate in Russia, in their view, under control. So from the moment Alexei was born, she was even more under pressure. You can see that Venus here, the ruler of the 5th, is also associated with the ruler of the 6th and the ruler of the 11th. She was always being put pressure by her peers to have that son, to have those children. She would put a lot of pressure in the children, because she wanted them to behave. She wanted them to be respectful in the way that she needed to present herself as. So she was also very harsh to the children. They grew up not being that spoiled, according to the servants, because they made their own beds. They were always encouraged to work and to do their own thing. But of course, they were aristocrats still.
Yeah, and the young boy, he was, I suppose, a little bit spoiled, because she was very, very worried about him. And they also tried to hide the fact that he was ill and that he had hemophilia. But, you know, if she had all these ailments before, I think that would be like another thing to worry about for her.
It was. And you mentioned that he tried to hide the disease. And you see that the sun here, it obfuscates, it obliviates everything else around it with its light. So it covers everything around it with its light. So you see Mercury, Venus and Mars here are in a condition that we call under the beams. And Mars, of course, is the significator for blood issues and all of that. So just speaks a little bit to one of the children having that blood problem and they trying to hide it because it's hidden under the sun's beams, so you can't see it. She always hid not only her son, but her 4 daughters as well. But when her son was born, all the attention of the 4 daughters was also directed to him and to keeping him safe and to keeping him company and to allowing him to grow up in the best way possible. And they became more and more isolated within their palaces because of that. So that sun covering the other planets thing is also important when we analyze the level of isolation and how she was trying to cover them from harm in a way with her positions. So
now at one point, the infamous Gregory Rasputin enters the stage. So can you tell us how that came about?
Well, Rasputin, he was, again, that fate kind of thing that happened in her life a lot. Because when Rasputin started emerging and he came to St. Petersburg in 1903, he was this priest that had gained some fame through being very spiritual, being someone who could heal a lot of people and someone who had mystical powers and could see the future and could prophesy, but also as someone who had a very nasty hygiene habits, like he didn't have them basically, and he was a womanizer basically. He used to exchange spiritual service for sexual favors and call it a spiritual work, and that is very well documented apparently for all the documentaries that I have seen. And the Tsarina, when Rasputin arrived, there was a reputation of him in St. Petersburg among the high clergy as well, because he was quite famous among the people. So when he got to St. Petersburg and Tsarina caught word of him, she sent for him when around Alexei was 3, because he had fallen from one of their boat houses or whatever, and he had hurt his leg, and he was in excruciating pain. He was probably going to die. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were very worried. And when Rasputin came into the scene, because the Tsarina sent to him as a last resort, he actually talked to the boy. He prayed upon putting his hands upon the boy's wound, and the boy eventually got better. The boy got better and better from that point on. It's said that the pain from the boy's leg kind of gave away instantly, and he started to recover a little bit of his color, at least from the material that we have access to openly. But you know, it might have happened anyway. It might have been just a lucky blow, for Rasputin. We will never know. But the fact is that from that moment on, the Tsarina started trusting him and wanting to keep him around, because he was the one that's going to secure that she wouldn't lose the only thing keeping her status in the Russian court. Of course, she didn't have any status in the Russian court. People didn't respect her already. But she was like in her head about it. And she was like, if I just make this work with this boy, people are going to respect me. And I'm going to show people that everything that has been going on was God's plan for us and for this boy all along. So she was desperately trying to cling to her own narrative that was trying to save herself from the reality that she was living. She was isolated in a foreign country that was in the brink of revolution, and she didn't want to accept that the people could turn on her and her husband. She thought that the people still saw them as gods, that archetypal sun and moon that would guide them in the darkness. And it didn't help that the people actually, in the celebrations that they held for the monarchy in 1913, were all enthusiastic about it. And it did seem that they could recover some popularity after that, but then the war broke out and then hell broke loose. Because the Tsarina, she trusted Rasputin along these last years, since Alexei was 3, up until he grew up. Her trust in him grew and grew, and she gave him more and more access to the palace and to the court. Of course, Rasputin was not integrated in the court. Nobody likes him that much, There are some clergymen that accept him as a holy man, but nobody wants to be associated with him because they know of the rumors that are associated with his image. So he wasn't very well accepted. Nobody heard his advice except for the Tsarina, but he was there and he was powerful because they knew that he could get the Tsarina to do whatever he wanted because she wanted her son to stay safe and healthy, and he was the only one who could cure him. In the chart,
and
we see
I was
again.
just gonna say, yeah.
Yeah,
Where do
in
you
the
see
chart,
it? That she's so. Where would you see like a personal advisor that is so close to her? Where would you look for that in the chart?
We see here that she has this Jupiter and Saturn dynamic again that makes her desperate to find her ideal. With that Jupiter exalted there, she has the opportunities to find her ideal matches to what she's expecting. I can imagine her praying for the Lord for some miraculous. She even says that Rasputin was sent from God. She thought very firmly that Rasputin, she was convinced that Rasputin was a present from God to keep her son safe, to guarantee that her son would get to the old age and to rule Russia as she had intended. And thus her role wouldn't be in vain. So for that, she trusted Rasputin because he fit the role. She got what she wanted. She got what she asked for. She got what she was expecting. The guru that was everything that everybody said that he was. He proved to her that he had those powers, but it came with a cost, that opposition from Saturn in the 8th house there. And it was one of the main things that built more and more distrust amongst the court and amongst the people from the Tsarina, because the rumors that she was being controlled by Rasputin, and Rasputin himself spreading rumors that he was sleeping with the Tsarina. Allegedly, this is documented history. People said that he was spreading these rumors. This came back to the Tsarina. She dismissed it because she thought that these were just malicious rumors. After all, she had herself been cast out from that court. What would impede them to do the same with someone that she held as a friend? So she was convinced that everyone was against her and Rasputin was her only ally. And in the end, that was one of the things that really fed the revolutionaries' discourse towards winning, towards the abdication.
Yeah, and Rasputin also gave some very bad military advice, if I understand correctly, and he was like involved in that. He sort of, got himself involved in that, and more and more people wanted to get rid of him, right?
He was assassinated. She was by the members of the Romanov family. Actually, I think Nikolai's cousin killed him off in his house and threw him in a frozen lake or river. And he was, but you said something interesting. He gave bad war advice. How could he give bad war advice? Well, when the Tsar went on campaign, because he went to the front lines to be in the camps and to be there commanding everything from the front and stuff like that, the Tsarina was extremely anxious about that, and he didn't hesitate. Nikolai didn't hesitate to put Alexandra in charge of state affairs back in the capital. And quickly, the rumors about her and Rasputin, many of them well-founded in the fact that she was taking advice from him that was leading to catastrophe in the battlefield, gain more and more power. And that was definitely one of the strongest arguments from the revolutionaries in favor of the abdication, in favor of the overthrowing of the Tsar. So he actually advised Nikolai in one instance to depose, to take out one of his most trusted commanders and to assume the position himself. But he didn't have any experience, any military experience. And so, of course, this was Alexandra's advice, telling Nick that Rasputin's advice was such and such, and you should follow it. Otherwise, things are not going to go as God has planned. And Nick believed that. It's also good to mention that the people around this time were very addicted to opioids.
Oh.
I want to say that the Tsarina and the Tsar both probably were very addicted to medicines that were said to alleviate their pain, including cocaine. So all of this scenario that we are seeing here, the aristocrats at that time, they used substances to keep themselves going and to keep themselves like stable under pressure. Of course, that's no stability. That's just a fake sense of control that you have when you're under those kinds of influences. But this might also have contributed, and we cannot ignore the fact that her body was under a lot of stress, and that these things, and Rasputin would administer also some kinds of medicine to them. These things would also play an important role in the way they directed or misled the country, rather.
Yeah, they would probably be very dependent upon him if he.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that they were wanting a sign from God of God, what should we do? And God showed them they should be overthrown because they weren't fit for the job. And I'm not saying that what happened to them was right. I absolutely don't believe that. But I'm saying that they were not innocent in the fact that their people were starving and suffering so much, and they were oblivious to it basically willingly. And they wanted to be. They were choosing a lot of the times to be. And this happens when that goes that way. So, do you have any questions for now? Do you want to say something?
Well, I was just thinking about their tragic end now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So there's this famous prediction by Rasputin that he sent a telegram, and this is, I think this is true because I see this in most sources that I check, if not all. I can't remember one that didn't mention this. He sent a note apparently to Alexandra saying that if one of your relations is responsible for my death within 2 years of the event, not one member of your family shall remain alive. Shall stay alive, shall be alive. Yeah. So, and that proved to be true because at the same time, the Tsarina was murdered with her family later on after the abdication. A lot of the Romanovs started being hunted down and killed along Russia. So it was really a massacre of that family. They lost a lot of members back then. A lot of people who didn't even have that much to do with royalty or anything, children, they were all slaughtered, thrown in mines and stuff like that. So, and by the way, the sister that she went to the marriage of, where she met Nick, that same sister that was married to a Russian, she was killed. She was also married to a Romanov. She was killed a day after the Tsarina. So again, here we see that siblings were also playing a part in that story. She had a lot of siblings who died because of that solar eclipse there. But
yeah, that's back to the connection between the third and the first house, right? With the siblings,
yeah,
always tied in together. That's really fascinating.
And in her own end, there was also like traveling issues because when she got arrested, when her husband abdicated, that happened in 1917 after the war. The First World War had been a failure. The Tsarina and the Tsar were much to blame for it in the eyes of the people, and they needed to abdicate. So the Tsar abdicated. He tried to abdicate in favor of his brother. He couldn't because his brother didn't want to get the throne. But his brother was also assassinated, even though he didn't want anything to do with the throne. And so they were arrested. They spent almost a year. No, they spent like 6 or 7 months in house arrest in, I think, Tsarskoye Selo, which is one of their palaces, a little apart from St. Petersburg. And they didn't have many servants. They were visited by many curious people who would just go there to look at the Tsar and his family like they were caged animals. And they wouldn't have like their servants to serve them in everything anymore. So you would see them being made by the soldiers that were supposed to watch them to clean certain parts of the palace, or to they would be seen doing hand strength work, labor, manual labor. So, but they liked it. Like it's said that the girls and Alexei and the Tsar, they kind of liked this new routine because they were home. They had a lot of that familial environment, but now they didn't have the responsibility anymore. And sure, they couldn't do a lot of stuff, and they were a little afraid of what's going to happen to them, but not that much while they were still there. They thought they were going to be rescued, taken to England or something like that. They weren't. And they were transferred instead in October or November to Bolsk, where they spent a few months in a house there, which was the governor's house. They called the governor's house, which was a state property, now owned by the Bolsheviks. And after that, they were transferred to the House of Special Purpose, as they called it, in Yekaterinburg. And they would never leave that house. They were kept there for a few months with their windows covered, so nobody would see them from the street. Alexei was badly injured for the last few months. He couldn't walk anymore. He was being carried all around by his parents and other people, by his father mainly and other people, because Alexandra couldn't carry him. She herself was very ill and couldn't walk for very long. And they were in a very bad situation towards the end of their lives, being so confined together and not knowing when this is going to end, and having barely enough to have their needs met at the time. Finally, they were woken up in the middle of one night, the 17th of July, 1918. They were taken down to a cellar. I want to point out that you have here this underground element of Mercury ruling the 4th house, being in the 12th here. You have Saturn representing lower parts, also like a cellar, like the dungeon of a place. In the 8th house here, those elements to her death. And she was shot in a basement, basically. You have Mars in the 1st house. She was shot to death in a basement with her whole family. So her children and the few servants that were left were also murdered with her. Which again, a stellium represents how many people were there. I mean, I just keep thinking about this misfortune happening in large scale all the time around her, and finally ending with a large scale event where she and a lot of people were killed. In this story, a lot of people were killed in a lot of the ways, in a lot of the moments that were important. This huge masses of people being murdered, not only in the war, but in the repression from the Russian police in a lot of instances.
Wow, that was absolutely fascinating, David. Thank you so much. Now we've been over a lot of what happened in Alexandra's life. And in our next episode, we're going to take a look at some specific timing techniques. So we'll go over this chart again and examine what kind of techniques can tell us exactly when all these things are going to happen, and when the parts of the natal promise will be activated. So I really look forward to that. And in the meantime, be sure to subscribe to this channel if you want to catch the second part of this episode. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't, do the same anyway. And David, I'll see you again soon. And I'm adding your info in the description box below for anyone who is interested in booking either a natal chart reading with you, or you also give private lessons, don't you?
Oh, I do. Yeah, I give this tutoring program. Like, if people want some tutoring and they're not sure how to go about their studies yet, they can come talk to me. I can offer some orientation. Yeah. So yeah, I also do that.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe you can tell us how people can reach you.
Yeah, I have an Instagram account called David Fischer Astrology. It's still new. I'm still adding some content to that, and it's going to be more and more English content for those English speakers out there. I speak Portuguese in that page mainly in my videos, so if any of you are Portuguese speakers, you can also check that out. But there will be more English content. There is some, but there will be more eventually. But you can reach me there and through my email that Michelle is going to make available in the chat box.
Yeah, I will. That's great. Okay, everyone, we'll be back soon. Take care. See you next time, David. Bye.
See you next time. Bye.